clothes that the kids wear. But at that time, you did dress for school. And when you came home, you just changed your clothes and put on your after-school clothes so that you could do some chores around the house. Splitting wood was always one of the favorite sports of a lot of people because a lot of people burned wood in their kitchen stoves. I know we always had 5 or 6 or 10 cords of wood that had to be split alongside of our home. That was common. And a lot of other people had the same thing. But using to wield an axe became a very, very common adjunct for a lot of the kids that lived in town. Now, it was also, I remember in the earlier days, that some of the clothes that we wore for boys were knickers. The knickers, like some of the golfers wear today, that was common dress for boys. Ordinarily, boys didn't wear the longer pants until they got to probably about the 8th or 9th grade. But as youngsters, they wore knickers. And in many cases, they wore button shoes. Not shoes with laces, buttons with laces. You had button hooks. I realize that for some people who don't quite understand that, you'd have to have a demonstration. But I'll see if I can't locate I have a button hook someplace in my memorabilia, and but I have pictures that my parents took of myself and my older brother, and we have button shoes. And ladies wore button shoes. Oh, yes. I see certain styles today, they still have button shoes. So that's the way it went. Now, I'm going to say one thing about the courthouse, which I failed to mention before. I told you about being down there square because that's the only thing was on there was the courthouse. Now, the original courthouse, of course, there was a small courthouse that had been built down at Crawford's Quarry. And then when the County Board of Supervisors came into being, they decided to move it to Rogers City because it was just more convenient to do it that way. There had also been a brewery down there at Crawford's Quarry. There was a blacksmith shop, and there was also a boarding house. There were several other little businesses that had grown up down there. But the Board of Supervisors decided that the place that they wanted to put the courthouse was designated originally as Courthouse Square by the old Rogers plat. But in the meantime, they had used it as a cemetery. Now, I don't know the number of graves that were in there at the time, but when they decided to do that, then, of course, they bought a piece of property out in the township, which is now the Rogers Township Cemetery. It's the way so it says right on the sign. And those graves were moved from the courthouse square to the new cemetery. They took out the old pine stumps that were still standing there and leveled the ground. That was about 1885, and that's where the courthouse was built. Now, certain portions, as I understand it, of the old courthouse, even though there were fires and stuff, always were intact. And some of that courthouse down there, the middle portion of it, still goes back to 1885. I just thought I'd mention that. Also on those grounds, where the city jail is right now, or the village or county jail, was the first tennis court in this area. They had a clay court there, and people actually played tennis there. Later on, tennis courts were built down on Lake Street. I helped, when I was working at Michigan Lime back in 28, 29, or 30, the plant built those courts. There were also courts that were built between the old high school and the new high school that were built by Michigan Lime. And just thought I'd add that in there. Now, let's see what else have I got here. Also, I might mention this. I don't know just for how many years we had it, but I'm thinking of primarily between the era about 1920 probably, and 1926, 27, 28 in there somewhere. We had a curfew in town. Curfew rang at 9:30. The big bell, which was the fire bell, struck at that time, and then later on they had a siren that blew. And all young kids under 16 years of age were supposed to get off the streets. That gave you enough time to go to the first show. And there was always a little game was being played, of course, on the part of the town marshal, who rang the bell, and kids in another part of town who didn't want to go home. Well, it became a little tricky at times as to just why, when you could use the curfew and when you couldn't use the curfew. I remember a few incidents where there were girls that were married at 15 and 16. They were married. Now the question was, what do? Do you kick those people off the street, tell them to get off the street? Well, they made exceptions to that. Well, then they found out certain people lied to them, the marshal, that they were married. Well, I think finally they just gave it up as a poor job. But it was nevertheless, it had its merit. You got off, and during the time that school was in session, it was a good idea, because those kids should go home and get ready for the next day, maybe study for a half hour or so. But that was part of life in the small town. And now, as far as entertainment, baseball field, the old baseball field, there were several fields around town, of course, where kids played ball, but the main field, of course, was Westminster Park, or we just called it the baseball field. There was a very nice field at one time. It had big covered grandstands. It had a field house where fellas could go and take showers. And they played a good quality ball. Yeah, the field had its limitations, of course, because it was a confined area. But nevertheless, there was a place where a lot of fun took place. It was also a football field. The first football field, the games that we played here in high school were played on that field. Now, what is not generally known is that was not a 100-yard field. That was a 90-yard field. You wouldn't have known it by just standing there watching, and I think a lot of people didn't know it. But the field was just a little bit short. It couldn't be a 100-yard field, but you would have butted your head right into a stone wall on one end and some barbed wire on the other. So they compromised. In order to have an end zone, they made it a 90-yard field. It just had 9 yards between the stripes instead of 10. Most people didn't know it. Now, the opposing teams that came in were told that, or the officials were told that, and the coaches were told that. Well, it was all right. It came out all right. But we didn't have a 100-yard field until we moved up to Gilpin Field. Now, Gilpin Field, that area was bought by the school district from Michigan Line for a small sum of money, and with the idea that they wanted to have room where they could put a baseball field, another baseball field, and also a full 100-yard football field. Now, the football field of which they play up there now is not the first one up there. The first one was built further over to where the baseball field is there now. But and this field that is there today was started probably along about 1935, and the muck was smudged off of there. Sometimes the muck was 3 or 4 feet deep. It was backfilled with fill that came from Michigan Lime, and the field was laid on top of that. During my year as superintendent, the lights were put in. Along about the time of the Korean War, 1954 or 55. And that was compliments Michigan Line. The school district they had enough money to buy the 64 lights, and that's all they had. But there were fellows at the plant who had sons playing football, and they wanted to watch them play, and most of the time the games were played Friday afternoon, and they played Saturday, and quite often on Saturday they were working Saturday. So they prevailed apparently, and they just made a gift of the whole thing. The whole lighting system was a compliment of Michigan Line. And that was compliments of Mr. Valentin, who of course was a graduate of Rogers City High School, and Mr. Clymer. Now, Mr. Clymer, who was the president of Michigan Line at that time, was stationed in Detroit. Supposedly, He didn't know anything about it. That was the story. This was all done on the hush-hush. Well, you couldn't take that much money, probably about $60,000 or $70,000 worth of material, and not have it accounted for as a pittance. No, it was just a nice gift. Now, also, basketball, of course, the original basketball that was played here was played in a building called the rink. Now, the rink is built just about where the bowling alley is today. It was built by a family named, I think, O'Neill. It was a good-sized structure. I think probably it was maybe about 40 or 50 feet wide, maybe 140 feet long, something like that. I'm just guessing. But it was a good-sized building, all wood, beautiful floor. It was called the rink, and I think it was designed originally to be a roller rink. But it was big enough to play basketball. You had to shoot over a few beams. But some of the finest athletes that Rogers City ever produced certainly played in that gym. And it was an entertainment center. Not only just for basketball. That's where basketball started for the high school, 12 and 13, or 11 and 12. The previous superintendent, Mr. H.H. Gilpin, was the coach. And he started the basketball. And the football, the first coach was a Mr. Sibley, who was the high school principal. He said they'd played a little football in high school up at Ishpeming and Nagawning as when he was a kid, but he didn't really know too much about it, but he knew the rules. And but that's here the point. But nevertheless, we played basketball there. They held lectures there. Political rallies were held there. Dances were held there. Plays were put on there. Operettas were put on there. And other entertainment that came in from the outside. That building lasted until I think about 1926 or 27 in there when it burned. The whole thing suddenly burned. Fortunately, in a very short period of time after that, the new high school came into being in the fall of 1928. I think for a period there of about 1 year, a half a year, we played all the rest of the basketball season out of town because we didn't have a place to play. But, well, that was part of it. But basketball was part of the winter entertainment. Sleighing was a part of the winter entertainment. Skiing was a part of the winter entertainment. Skating was a part of the winter entertainment. A lot of house parties. And in those house parties during that day, of course, a lot of dances were held, of course, at the rink. A lot of house parties that were held. Dancing was the chief entertainment. We danced to the music of the big bands on records. Pulled up the. It wasn't too much wall-to-wall carpeting in those days. There were a lot of rugs. So you could just pick up the rugs and get down to good hardwood floors and throw a little dance wax on the floor, and away you went. And we sleighed. Of course, I mentioned that we sleighed on the hills. And in the summertime, in the wintertime also, we did a lot of hunting. We hunted rabbits. Right top where the high school is now, and where Glenn's and Ford Garage and all those areas, we hunted rabbits and partridge up there. We had camps up there. Kids actually built camps, regular, what you would call a camp like you have for hunters. And we had bunks up there. We had tables up there. And we stayed there overnight on weekends. Well, we hunted partridge and rabbit. There were very few deer, now you understand. At that time, in the 20s. The deer didn't come back here until after about 1935. Now, there was some deer hunting that took place at Drummond Island, and a good number of the fish tugs down here, practically all the fish tugs, 4 or 5 or 6 of them, would take loads of local men over to Drummond Island to hunt deer. Some men hunted down below the Hillman area, in what they call the Turtle Lake area. And that was the area where they had reestablished. But I remember going down here at the docks during deer season, watching some of those tugs come back in who had hunters on them in Hunter Island, and some of those tugs would have 4 or 5 or 6 deer on them. But around here immediately, it was after 1935, because I came back here to teach in 1935, and that's the first fall that I had ever hunted deer. I didn't get a deer for the first couple of years, and then I got one, I think, in the fall of 37 or 38 out in the Lost Lake area. I hunted deer for about 35, 38 years, I think. And during that period of time, I think I got about 20, 22 deer, as I recall it. Lots of fun. But that's what we did in the wintertime. A lot of deer hunting. There was some hiking that went on, snowshoeing, skiing. Didn't think of calling it cross-country skiing, but that's what people did. A lot of duck hunting. I did a lot of duck hunting, and so did a lot of other people. We used to hunt ducks right here in town, Seagull Point. Excellent spot. But of course, you got to remember there were a lot more ducks than there are today. We used to hunt at Adams Point. We hunted at the Portage at Presqu'île. We hunted at Little Lake. Swan Lake was one of my favorite spots to hunt ducks in the early days. And there were ducks. There were a lot of ducks available. And you could go into those areas just by asking permission to go. And now in the summertime, of course, there was other entertainment. We quite often in Rogers City, and as well as small town, when the circus would come to town. In case of Rogers City, the circus came in by train, came up to the depot, and they marched down 3rd Street. And the circus grounds of those early days was right where the St. Ignatius Catholic School and the priest's house and the convent is. That was the circus grounds. That's where zebras and monkeys and lions and tigers. And of course, those kids went down there and hauled water for the elephant. You ever try to fill an elephant up with water? Well, that's a big job. Another reason that they went at that spot was that just on top of the hill, there was kind of an opening up there. There was a farm up there, and there was good grass up there. And they would take the animals up there and let them graze on the grass. And just below the hill, somebody years and years ago had punched a hole into a well. An artesian well flowed there on the bay that just flowed winter and summer. And there was a good supply for the elephants and all the other animals that needed water. And then another form of entertainment that would come in, and that was the Chautauqua Show. You've heard of the Chautauqua shows that came out of New York, Chautauqua, New York. They were summer entertainments under the tent. They came into every little town, spent a week, and they put on a variety of good, wholesome entertainment. There were plays, there was comedies, there were tragedies, and they put on magic shows, and you name it. It was a general variety summer entertainment. Very good. And they sold a few candies and stuff on the side. In the afternoons, they'd put on entertainment shows for the kids. And then we had another one called the Kelly Stock Company. That was a show that put on regular plays. Come in, stay a week. It was put on by this Kelly family. They've been with it for many, many years. They set up in a variety of places around town, wherever there was a few hundred square feet of area available, they put up their show. Usually it was down by next to the city hall. And it was good quality education. Then there was the Bond Steel Players. I think that they came out of Detroit. I remember it was a high class, when I say high class, I mean a very good class of plays. And I think most of the time they put it on in the rink during that period that the rink was there. Is that right, Carl? And then there was another couple more, one more at least that I want to talk about, and that was the medicine show. I remember about 1917, 18, 19, even 19 I think it was. Yeah. There was a medicine show called the Tonal Show. And it was just a small circus kind of affair, a small circus tent, not too big, probably not over, enclosed an area maybe about, I'd say roughly about 40 by 50, maybe that's all, if that was that much. And they had dogs that would entertain. They had jugglers, they had monkeys, and they had ventriloquists. It was just a variety of show. But the two things. The acts didn't last very long, then they sold candy. They sold candy for a dime a sack. got a few pieces of Candy Kisses or whatever that happened to be. And then they also sold a product called Tonal, which was a cure-all. They didn't say cure, they just said it would help everything, from arthritis to deafness. You name it, they had it on the label. It was good for all these things. Sore toes, dandruff, heart disease, palpitations, rheumatism, every form of disease that you could think of, stomach ulcers, and, pancreas, everything, liver problems. They had it listed on this label. It didn't say it was a cure-all, it just said it was good for. Well, old Doc William Arscott, the old man, he was furious most of the time about that. But as I got to know him well, of course, he was a neighbor. He lived right across the street for years. And he was on the Board of Education when I was principal. And he says, those guys were clever. See, when they came in before, Prohibition set in. Anybody could buy alcohol. Well, they would take this alcohol, and he said they actually had a porcelain vat where they mixed this stuff in the back of their tent. They put in so much alcohol, some cascara, they put in some brown sugar, and then water, and throw a few other little things in. And as Dr. Arscott said, he said, really, he said, if they'd have sold it, and not called it medicine, he said it'd have been all right. But he said they were clever. But he said the biggest thing about it was that it had cascara in it and had alcohol. And he said that appealed to a lot of those suckers. He said a lot of those fellas, he said all they needed was a good physic. And he said this supplied it. And he said, oh gosh, everybody, he said they come back the next day and buy 4 or 5 bottles at $1 a bottle. He said it wasn't worth 25 cents. He said including the glass. But nevertheless, that's the way the business went. Well, they would stay a week. Doc said he was always glad when they left, because he was the health officer, not just a doctor, he was the health officer. But they played just inside the law, and what put them out of business? Prohibition came back. Aha. Yeah, that was a different horse with a different color. And so that put the kibosh to that. He said he understood that for years they still roamed the West. But he said they never came back to Rogers City, for which he was glad. Then the city band, of course, like now, played weekly. Just where that started, nobody seems to know. I remember the July 4th, 1919, the one that I remember most, because that was the year I went to St. Louis right after that. Went down to the parade, when the parade came by. And the thing I remember about the parade was that there were some soldiers from 1918, 19 who came marching by, a good contingent, because there were a good number of people from Rogers City that had been involved in the training camps. Another thing I got to tell you about the 19 also. That in this one car, after the soldiers went by from World War II, there was a car that had 2 people in there. Peyton. And they were veterans of the Spanish-American War. There was a man named Louis Crush and a man named Frank Thompson. They had fought in the Philippines, looking for Aguinaldo, the famous renegade down there, and been stationed on the island of Mindanao. I got to know, I knew Louis Crush very well because his son was one of my great friends for all his life. And he told us some of the stories of serving in the Philippines. Now, the other thing that impressed me was that in this other one that came by was a single man sitting. And he was a veteran of the Civil War. Man about 81 or 83 years old, somewhere in there. The man was Schlager. And he used to walk by the house. I don't know just which Schlager family he fit into. But my mother told me that afterwards that he was a part of a Michigan regiment. And when done, he would have just been about right if if he had fought in the Civil War, this was about 1919, 1920, that's 20, yeah. He'd been about 80, in his 20s when he was in service. And she said that he fought with a Michigan regiment that had took part in the Battle of Gettysburg. But he was still walking by at that time. And she said that at the time that she had been in 1900, there were, she didn't remember about, she said there were about a dozen of those fellows that had marched in that parade of 1901 to introduce the new century from this area. And I suppose those were fellows that were lumberjacks in the woods, at that time, because they couldn't have been fellows around 60 years of age in that area, or whatever the case might be. Now, another thing that I remember about the era then, in the 20s, were the silent movies at the Old Star Theater, where you'd go in and it would be silent. Stuff would flash on the screen, printing under it. You had to be able to read. And over here, sitting alongside of you, might be some lady, kind of reading under very, very quietly, reading to her husband who couldn't read. And I remember there were several of those there. And that's the way that went. And there was a piano player in the corner down there that played the appropriate music, depending upon what the theme of the show was, whether it was a war scene or whether it was a love scene or a western. They played the appropriate music for that. Some of those piano players were very, very accomplished. And of course, some of them afterwards were piano teachers. And a good number of people alternated at that job over the years. And there, you had them in every theater. Every theater had those people. Some of them had organs. And some of the big theaters had big organs. And so that's the way that went. Now we also, besides, say, the duck hunting, the deer hunting in the summer, we went fishing. We fished for trout. Trout River is always a good trout stream, and it still is today. Not too many years ago, I was still hauling steelhead and brown trout out of there, in good number. And I know this spring they took some dandies out of there again. And in my day, the upper there, all the way up to US 23, across US 23, US 23, and into the Upper Swan area, goes way back into the Wenzel Farm area. We used to go fishing. And we fished the Upper Swan, and we fished Silver Creek, and we fished the Little Akyat, we fished the Big Akyat. Trout fishing was always a lot of fun. Now, during that period of when I was in high school, of course, it was Prohibition. Beer, spirits were illegal. It was the era of the bootlegger. In Detroit, it was the era of the Purple Gang. In Chicago, it was the era of Al Capone. Prohibition, as I say, manufactured some tremendous economic and social problems for this nation. And that's why apparently it was easy to vote in, and it was easier even to vote it out. Because some of the problems that it created are probably still with us today. Now, what else do I have here that I'd like to mention? Oh yes, another thing I'd like to remember that I recall was that in 1918-19, at the tail end of the war, there was an influenza epidemic in the nation. Very severe flu. And a good number of people died. Some estimated 500,000, some estimated 750,000 died. And they had an awful time trying to control it. And fellows died in training, in the boot camps, died. And local here, people died of that. And they tried to discourage as much as possible people gathering together in groups. There were periods of time, I know, at least 2 months, maybe more than that, of that school year, that they canceled school. And I know they try to discourage people as much as possible from going and gathering at the show, or even go to church, Mother said. People did go, but for every excuse probably they didn't go, because they were just afraid as to who they hit next. Now, one of the recommended procedures, of course, against the flu was to fumigate. They didn't know whether there was a virus or whatever called it, whether it came out of the air or came out of what. And I know that my folks decided to fumigate. They turned the house over to the public health department, or health officers. They came in. We moved out of the country for over a weekend, 3 or 4 days, whatever it is. Of course, we had a place to go. They came in and they set up pots or smudge pots of one kind or another. And this stuff reeked through the house, in through every crevice. When we came back at 3 or 4 hours, the house smelled very, very strong. It smelled very strong for whole months at a time. Everything in the house had to be washed. Whether it did any good, we didn't get the flu, but that was common. Fumigate. And so everything that you had to use, clothing stuff, everything had to be washed. Now, I don't know whether it would hurt clothes or anything, but nevertheless they washed it anyway. And all the utensils, all the knives, forks, spoons, everything. I know that a lot of the stuff out of the whole kitchen area, my folks moved out to the barn, or during the period that they were gone. Anything in the form of food or kitchen utensils, so they wouldn't have to wash them over again. They just packed them in crates and dynamite boxes and took them out to put them in the garage. And but the smell of that you could smell on articles even several years later. You put it right up your nose. Part of it. Well, let's see, what else do I have here? What did the kids work at in the summertime? Well, some of the boys worked at the Michigan line. Some of the kids worked on farms in the area. Some of the girls worked at resorts at the various lakes. Some worked at the resorts at Grand Lake, at Fireside Inn. Some of them worked at the resorts around Mullet Lake and Burt Lake. There are a good number of resorts up there where girls went up to Mackinac City, the Mackinac Island, and resorts along the Sheboygan River. These places were loaded with people that would come up for the summer. And then, of course, in the we also were entertained. We picked huckleberries, we picked raspberries. Some we kept for our own parents. Some we sold. We picked blackberries. We picked hazelnuts. We picked beech nuts. And we kept ourselves pretty well occupied. Played a lot of baseball, played a lot of scrub ball. Now, scrub ball, what is scrub ball? Well, scrub ball is a game played, it's baseball when you don't have enough for 2 full teams. You rotate. You rotate. 3 people at bat. You can play with as low as 11 or 12 players. You rotate at bat. And it's a lot of fun. You can play it with softball or you can play it with a hard ball. I can't tell you all the rules about it. If we got back on the field, I suppose I could remember them, but it was good entertainment. And if you didn't, if you just didn't have enough. And then, let me see here. What else have I got here? Oh, I was also going to tell you about Rogers City. Like every small town, certain areas of town have a name given to them. And I just want to kind of review some of the areas of Rogers City as I remember from the early days. There was the original plat for the village of Rogers, and then places were added on. Here, a guy owned 10 acres, they added it onto the city. Here's another guy who owned 20 or 5 or 7 or 8 or whatever it was. And these additional areas were called additions. There was an area up here, just south kind of the east end of town called the Tank Edition. It means that the area owned by Tank was added on to the town. There was Gums Edition. My folks happened to live in Gums Edition. Gums Edition was an apple orchard, and a pear, plum, cherry orchard. Then there was an area down near the plant, right on just as we go to the plant this way, called Little Italy. Beautiful Italian village down there with very, very lovely people, the Italian people. And then there was Polish Town. Now I realize today that somebody might take offense to that, but down there we just called it Polish Town. That's where the Polish people lived. Think on our butt. And South 1st Street, South Lake Street, South 2nd Street, 1st Lake, and Kelside Road. Yeah, that was the area. That's where they lived. Then there was an area called Silk Stocking Street. That was South Lake. That was Lake Street, Lake Street, and South and 1st Street area. That's people down there. They were CEOs. They had money. Then there was Battlefront. Now there's a good name. In a Battlefront is an area that extends between Woodward and Ira Street along the railroad tracks. The plant built homes in there on both sides. And the homes are very, very close together. The railroad went right down the middle of the what you call it. And the name Battlefront came. They said years ago, the kids would pick up these rocks about the size of an inch or two and throw them at each other. So they called it Battlefront. The train, said that when the train went by years ago, they wouldn't throw stones at the cars, but they would throw stones at the boxcars that went by, or if gondolas went by, because they make a lot of noise. So they called it Battlefront. Then there's an area in town on South 5th Street, still there today, called Mauer's Pond. Now the pond isn't there, but the depression creating the pond is still there. If you go down South 5th Street today, look to the right, against the cliff of hills, you'll see a depression coming in there. That is where Mauer's Pond was, and that's had a good head of water. Had 5 or 6 feet of water. You used to go up there skinny dipping. That was the first place we went swimming in the spring of the year. Go to Mauer's Pond. And then there was an area called Tober's Hill. Now, these various hills that I told you about where we used to sleigh down. There was the Tober's Hill. There was Hef's Hill. There was Erkfit's Hill and Belmore's Hill. There was the Hornbacher Hill. There was Lark's Hill. Where are you going sleighing tonight? Going Lark's Hill. You know where that was. Going to Tober's Hill. Okay. Then there were other areas in town. There's Delgit's Woods. Delgit's Woods, part of it's still there. You go down between Woodward Avenue and Ontario, between 1st and 2nd Street, and you'll run into an area which is still pretty heavily wooded. That was called Delgit's Woods. It's still there today, hasn't changed. Then there's the Pines. As a kid. The Pines is where the Westminster Church stands today. That was a beautiful, beautiful grove of white and yellow pine. Just beautiful. And that was kind of an amphitheater in there. Young folks in the early days used to gather in there. They'd go in there and they'd have roasts in there. And they'd have sing fests in there. I see pictures that, Carl, you had in the book in History of Rogers City, where people had gathered at the Pines. That's where it was. And I have a letter in my possession. I saw it again the other day. Which it says Rogers City, the Pines. The lady that lived right next door, the Osgood family, used to write me letters when I was in the hospital in St. Louis, Missouri. And her home had a name on it. A little plaque that said the Pines. That was, they owned those lots. She and her husband gave those lots to the church when that church was built back in 1924. I've got a rock in that church. Then there's an area which is no longer around, and that's Petersville. Petersville was a little town, a little settlement, a little subdivision, just on the edge of town here, just north of town, south of town. It was a farm originally. There were probably 25, 30, maybe 40 homes there. People lived there. They had a grocery store there. There was a gas station there. There was a turkey farm there. Today it's gone. It's just completely gone. The quarry came in. Bought them out. There's a hole in the ground. That's all there's there. Strange. I ran into a girl the other day at a class reunion who lived there all the time that she went to school. It had been a farm. Originally it was a farm. The farm was called the Simon's Farm. One of the Simon's girls married a fellow named Peters. And the farm didn't do too good, so he subdivided the land and sold it as lots. Little did they dream that one day they would sell out. Petersville Farm was also the first place that I saw an airplane land in the Roger City area. Lit on this farm. Barnstorm, probably about 1920. Came through after World War I, a couple Army pilots. There was a smooth area of land in there that they thought was good enough, so they did. They investigated it, brought their plane up, and the 4th of July, you could go out there for $2, they'd give you a ride around Roger City. Then there was an area of town which is called the German Church area. Now the church is gone. It's now a parking lot for the Lutheran school. It's on 5th and Erie. There's Hog Island, which is a little area up here on the way to the Sportsman's Club. Hog Island. There's the worm beds. That's up there in the area where those homes are, right across from Glenn's, just in back of Glenn's store. That's where most people in town who went fishing went up to the worm beds. You could always get worms up there with a very heavy bog, muck land. There was the creamery. The creamery is also in that very area. There was a creamery up there at one time. That's just right about the back of McDonald's up there, going toward the lake, across the road. There is Platt's Edition. I happen to live in Platt's Edition, an unplatted area. It wasn't staked out. It's meets and bounds. No lot number. There's the Lincoln Edition. That was a little park. Still there. Parts of it there, I guess, are still there today. We used to go there as kids when we were in grade school, elementary school. That's where we had our picnics in Lincoln Park. That's in the area there where Cease Hodgetts lives. You probably know that. Or Millie Orts lives. That's Lincoln Park. That's the area of Lincoln Park. Now, there might be other places I understand might call Lincoln Park, but that's the one that I knew of. There, the area of the fish docks. It's still there. That's the Little Round Lumber Company area. There's the area of the fish docks. Polk's Landing. Polk's Landing is up there where Kazimirski had his mill, and now Storm's Ice Company has a business. That was a landing there for logs. That's where logs were brought in. They were stacked up there in large piles and run through mills there at that place. There was Hef's Dock, which is no longer there, located at the foot of Erie Street. There was a dock that went out there 150, 300. Yeah, went out there a good 300 feet, probably 400 feet. And that's where the D&C boats used to come in, pick up their freight, take out their freight. And then there was Seagull Point. That's still there today. A big well house on Seagull Point. But I used to go up there long before that, when I was in high school, during duck season. Try to get up there the first one, so you get the choice spot for a blind. throw out a few decoys on long, long strings. And if the weather was right, man, you have some shooting. All you had to do was have enough shells. But there are others that would be there pretty soon, almost every time there was a good wind. The wind had to be right, because there's no use going if the wind was wrong. But Siegel Point was also kind of a rendezvous, kind of a little lover's lane. And at that time, of course, the bridge across the mouth of Trout River was there, and that was the only one across. The one across in US 23 didn't go through until 1935. When they built US 23 from Alpena to Sheboygan,